I've been hesitating to speak. Perhaps the question of whether to pass the microphone on might have been a better one. I confess that the thing is that I feel a little bit like a fish out of water here. My role as an academic is essentially one of being analytical and trying to problematize things. And settings like this have a function, and it is to produce outcomes and to move towards policy formulations. And one of the things that I've been trying to think a lot since yesterday is that I don't have concrete proposals to make about policies. And that's an important thing for me personally to think about in terms of my interventions in the public sphere. However, I still think that whereas yesterday I advocated the notion of being disruptive, perhaps today I should no longer be so and keep silence. But at the same time, when I heard the speaker who spoke before, I just felt that there was a need to problematize some of the notions. So that, for example, to speak about the notion of identity politics and identitarianism in terms of a resurgence of the narcissism of small differences is extremely problematic because it disembeds and, in an abstract sense, generalizes something which is always particular. In other words, identity politics is shaped by a specific context of struggle in which identities emerge. So the reason you have identity politics in particular settings, like in the United States context of racism, in the context of racism of urban cities in Europe, as opposed to in the Mediterranean region or Arab world and so on, is embedded in specific forms of struggle. And those identities are some more progressive than others, and that's what we have to pay attention to. So there's a problem with generalizing the notion of narcissism of small differences in relation to identitarianism. But more in particular, there's the notion that our chair quite rightly said, and that I think is the impact that it would have, that the talk that we were given about the referred specifically to the Euromed area, but has lessons for wider relations between Europe and the rest of the world. Well, that's where I think it is extremely problematic to do this. Now, obviously, the speaker was speaking on behalf of the Arab world. He said at certain times the Arab world needs Europe and so on. I do not claim to speak for the Arab world, nor have any interest in doing so, but I am Muslim and do speak as with a public voice as a Muslim and on Muslim affairs. And in that regard, of course, there is the fact that the Arab world is a very tiny element of the Muslim world, which is, of course, in the South Asian and Southeast Asian world much larger, and the Indian subcontinent much larger than the Arab world. Now, what is particularly important here, and the only reason I come to mention is this. Yesterday, I tried to mention several times the fact that we must think of relations between Europe and the rest of the world in terms of trans currents, in terms of intercultural relations between Europe as well as outside. Europe has significant Muslim populations at the moment and considers that to be part of issues that it has to deal with as well. And it tends a lot of times to project its relations with the Muslim world outside and onto Muslim populations inside. And in that regard, I wanted to make one remark. What we heard was essentially this, that Europe had enlightenment, and with enlightenment rationality, that the Arab world, through certain travelers who came to Europe, learned about modernism and modernity, took it back to its countries, implemented it. Suddenly, and we had the beginning of development, progression, modernism, and so on. Then suddenly we have a crisis. And the crisis is related in part to Islam, in part to poverty and the problems of the Arab world. And now the Arab world needs Europe. It needs Europe for development, it needs Europe for modernity, and in order to fight the common struggle against integralism and extremism. Well, part of the problem is the notion of these reductive categories, because we must think separately, and there is a lot of tendency, unfortunately it has become more carefully dealt with, particularly in countries such as Britain, where there is a very developed discourse on this, to separate out notions of Islamism from notions of extremism, from notions of fanaticism, which was a word that was very rooted in the Enlightenment and used here, and terrorism. So there are phenomena of Islamism in the Muslim world throughout. They must be thought of in terms of their own rationalities, in terms of their own politics, in terms of how Europe must engage with these legitimately elected governments in the countries where they have emerged. And to think of it simply as some sort of virus that is disrupting the Muslim world and which we must fight against the developers of the Enlightenment is extremely problematic. the Enlightenment in Europe was compatible with and built on slavery, colonialism, and racism. It had absolutely no problems with this. To simply say that what we need is the Enlightenment rationality is extremely problematic. Europe needs to revisit its cultural heritage, I said yesterday, and Europe, in its policies towards the rest of the world, needs to think not only that it has to export, and the particular problematic of this morning's talk was this, that in speaking, although the speaker claimed no such role, but the impact that it has is, here is the Arab world speaking, here is the Muslim world speaking, and it's asking for Europe to come and save it. Well, it's more problematic than that. And what Europe needs to do, it was said several times yesterday, is to open itself out to the possibilities that there are different rationalities, different modernities, and that Islamism is actually got something that is not only its own project for alternative modernities, but that it also can have something to give to the West. Now, if the West deals with its Muslim populations on this model, which is it must also civilize them, culturalize them, bring them into modernity and so on, that's extremely problematic. And lastly, just to remember that the terrorism, which we all want to fight against, the terrorism that we are facing is not a terrorism of pre-modernity. It is a terrorism of post-modernity. So it's not simply the exporting of technical modernity to the Arab world that's going to fight it.